speed as a reminder for those of you that have been here for a week, and then for those that just showed up, so you can pick up where we are. And then today, what we're going to be doing is session 5 in this book, session 5. And this afternoon, we'll be doing session 6 and 7 in this book. So, let me share my screen. Can I do some screen sharing? Okay. Okay. So let me bring us into what we've been doing. We started with paradigm curves for gospel progress. It's the first thing we talked about. And let me get to a few things to tell you about. Single sheet here, please. Paradigm curves for gospel progress. We showed this chart about when you zoom all the way out to paradigms. Hans Kuhns makes the argument that there's been 5 big paradigms since the early apostles. And then he argues that there's a new paradigm that we're living in that's emerging. And so we're taking, and David Bosch says that, lots of other authors said that, Roland Allen hearkened that in early 1900s when he was then in the Anglican system, but in India and China in particular. He said we have to get back to the way of Christ and his apostles as the New Testament authors, the apostles. So how will this emerging paradigm, how will it be shaped? Will we shape it by what? The traditions, the secondary traditions that we've created over these last hundreds of years and thousands of years, or will we go back all the way back to, as Philip Jenkins says, pre-modernism? The only thing relevant in a postmodern world is pre-modern. Then we talked about, let me show you one other chart, and then I will go into, this was the other thing we talked about. This doesn't work very well. We talked about the curves themselves, the paradigm curves themselves, and how we spent a lot of years, or a lot of the networks out there, when you look at the last 40, 50 years, in the first curve of leadership training, of master craftsmen, apprenticeships, portfolios, how there's been a lot of work and a lot of focus and a lot of felt needs on that curve, but we've also simultaneously been saying how these next years we have a sense from on the ground, we have a sense from you, we have a sense ourselves from our own churches, how we're really beginning to put emphasis and focus on building the second and third curve. It doesn't mean the first curve is over. We're continuing to iteratively move up that curve, and we always need to be in that curve. But from a global perspective, how we can't just be training people, we actually have to be, and we can't just be planting new churches, we have to be building those churches as families and building networks of churches. Networks of churches like Paul did, and then we have to make them sustainable with marketplace benefactors, Philippian churches, and self-enterprising work of those apostolic teams. Then we go through each curve. I think that's maybe enough. That's that we go through each curve for you. We talk about incommensurability of paradigms. We talk about the social distribution of how paradigms get adopted, and that helps you really process critical mass or the tipping point in paradigms. Oh, and then here's the incommensurability, how one paradigm is playing checkers and the other paradigm is playing chess, and they're playing on the same board. And so when we say something like going to church, some people think this picture in their mind, and yet you read the New Testament letters and they think they're prescribing and talking more about what's on the other side. And so what does that, they're incommensurate with one another. They use a different lexicon, a different set of words in order to define that paradigm. So that's what we started our time with. Then we went into teaching, mastering the scriptures here. And Jeff talked about in this first one, session one here, our second session here, talked about, Walt Kaiser had said, we have a crisis of hermeneutics. And that was in the 80s. A crisis, an absolute crisis across all of Christianity, we have a crisis in hermeneutics. And
the first crisis of its nature in the last 400 years.
In the last 400 years. So you've heard us talk about him and respect for him and his acumen of understanding these things. And so getting back to a new perspective for us in our day and rethinking Western hermeneutics. And we talked about Paul was a coherent thinker, not a thinker that just had all these abstract and crazy ideas that were all disconnected, and then it took someone in the last couple hundred years who's so academically smart to organize them into a system. He was a coherent thinker, he was an integrated thinker, and he was given the tradition or the administration of the plan of the mystery. He was given the plan. And so we have to get back to that plan, and we have to understand his schema, his whole framework, his principles that undergird the framework, and then some processes and practices that are normative, but certainly the schema and principles is the bulk of his instructions and the bulk of what he's left for us. So we talked about that. We talked about the canonical structure of Paul. And so we've talked about how this is Paul. These are tools that get you around Paul's corpus. Maybe, let me just show you this picture. So these are Paul's early letters. These are Paul's middle letters right here, and these are Paul's later letters. This creates his entire corpus, the Pauline corpus. In understanding what he's doing in the early, in the middle, and the late, you can begin to see the framework of how we are to build churches, and to build churches as families, and to build networks of churches. But if you're just taking isolated topics and picking out verses and preaching on them, you're not going to be able to understand the whole framework of the whole forest that Paul and Christ left for us. You're not going to be able to have the mind of Christ. You're just going to be taking leaves off the tree and bringing people that little leaf of wisdom rather than the whole forest with all its roots. We haven't talked a lot about this. Jeff and I have kept referring to it, and I've referred to it quite a bit because I'm so excited about it because we're in the middle of it. But this is the Petrine circle right here in orange. It gets you back to Peter's circle and the diaspora, which is all out of the Acts 2. When people were dispersed after Acts 2, then these apostles then years later wrote them letters because they had circled amongst them. So Peter wrote to the diaspora. James starts his letter and says to the diaspora churches. Hebrews, by its very name and in the context of why it was written to the diaspora churches. Mark, the gospel of, and Matthew, the gospel of, the books were written to those same diaspora churches. They're all in that Petrine circle. And we've been going through Hebrews, which is why our churches are writing songs about Melchizedek. And then, of course, so we're finishing that one up here in our own church network, and we'll be done with that here in just 2 weeks. And then we're going to move on to John. We'll get done with John hopefully in the next 10 months.
Well, September. Okay, you heard it here first. September. Jeff and I always have a banter back Which
and
means
forth on
how I usually estimate I think end of August is when we were doing our schedules, but that means we should have it by February.
So
that'll set him off, see, because
yeah,
this idea.
Yeah, because I want to, we got to get to all our global partners, and we were talking about Kenya and Uganda last night, and we got to keep this progress in our minds as well as all the travel. So that was session 1 and 2, and I'm actually going to jump then. Let me show you. We have 2 more sessions to update you on, and then we will hop in. I'm just going to go to, I've talked some about how all of us, we've got to, as leaders of leaders, all of us have to do our own work. We have to work hard like a farmer, be disciplined as a soldier, and train like an athlete. We have to do that. We have to be able to put this, stay in the schema, stay in the framework that Paul gives us, but be able to make it our own. We have to be able to carry this. You should be able to, at some point in your lifetime, carry the framework of all 27 letters of the New Testament in your head. It is possible. You can do it. If they're isolated little leaves on trees, I don't think you're never going to be able to do it. It's way too fragmented. You can't do it. Your mind cannot do that. But the letters were left so that we can understand the framework and have the mind of Christ and carry that. 1 Peter says in his 3rd literary section, he says, build a complex state of mind. That's how you get unity. Everyone. Build a complex state of mind. Arm yourself with the same intentions, he says. So, okay, session 3, what we've talked about was Paul was passing on the tradition, the primary tradition. He talks about that in many other places, but it is Christ's tradition. It's from the apostles and other apostles. Peter, even in his letter, says that Paul's letters are the tradition and that they're hard to understand, they're heavy meat, but you've got to understand them because they're the Word of God. We talked about the Greek rhetorical schematic of topos and topai, and how these arguments are all connected to one another. It's a constellation of ideas and constellation of arguments. They're not just isolated topics. We talked about Paul's early, middle, and later letters, which we've already mentioned a little bit, and how there's organizing centers to them, which gets you back to the topoi, and topos idea. And so how Romans 16, when Paul says, now I've established you in my gospel, that is the gospel of Jesus Christ, that's a summation for all the early letters. And you look at Ephesians 3, that the pillar and support of truth. No, that's 1 Timothy 3. Ephesians 3, the manifold wisdom of God will be made known through the church. The church is the centerpiece of Christ's plan, not parachurches, not Bible colleges, but the church is Christ's plan. And it's 1 Timothy 3, how his church is to be a family. So the connection of Ephesians 3 and 1 Timothy 3 we put there with even the Greek words are in the same family. And then we spent quite a little time on, when you look across Paul's letters then, there's literary benchmarks, we're calling them, but benchmarks of how Paul actually was building the churches, building teams, and building a network of churches. And you can see by the decisions he made, the problems he's solving, we get a framework that can last for thousands and thousands of years and work in every single culture if we tie our minds to that schema. So many times, and those of you that were here 2 days ago, and all the time, we make excuses about why our culture can't do this. But we can tie ourselves to Paul's schema and the mind of Christ and build our churches today. Then we did session 4 in the book, and we talked about the process of doing theology and culture within the grand strategy schema. We've got to be able to solve problems in our churches, and we've got to solve problems in our communities with the grand strategy and the schema in our minds and in our churches. So we make an argument there that as a new Christendom emerges, we can stay with the Western institutional paradigm, Reformed and other Protestant traditions. We can start a new tradition. And Jeff read a quote there of a liberation theology out of the, and it said, she is writing from an Afro-feminist, African, womanist, feminist and womanist perspective, and that's how we need to read into the text. So we can do that and try to come up with a new way to read the text, or we can go all the way back to the beginning and look at what did the author mean and how did he organize his purpose, author's intent, and his design. Because, of course, the argument is once you understand the author's intent and his design, then you can get these tools like over here and understand the framework of how to build churches as families and how to build networks of churches. We talked about there is a traditioning process. Paul is passing on a tradition, but he's not passing on, we're not to do a whole, Luke, Timothy, Johnson, Jeff was talking about, there's no theology of Paul. You're not going to write a whole book on Paul's theology, because if you think that's what you're doing, then you're misunderstanding the system, the ever unending, infinite problem-solving system that God gave us. We can solve infinite amount of problems and endless problems if we just follow his schema. It's the traditioning process and the schema is the same, but our problems and our cultures are always changing and always, we live in the most fast-paced world in the history of the world. Our cultures change, they say, and our lexicon changes today, and our vernacular, what's up, bro? Every 5 years right now. Every 5 years, the lexicon and the culture in many cultures are changing. And so we need to be able to have this framework in order to solve these problems in our churches. So we talked about the difference between when you have your ministries of having programs, rules, policies, or procedures, which is what most entities do when you create ministries or create churches or denominations. And then you say, Jeff, you were given that example of being baptized 3 ways forward, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, versus the other denomination is baptized 3 times backwards, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so in our disunity, that's our unity in the Protestant programs, rules, and policies. But what Paul is setting out is a schema, framework of how to think, principles that undergird it, and then a handfuls of processes and practices that we need to use. We gave example of leadership boards, of how writing papers to help solve problems. And I think we talked about using this tool. This tool, I brought my own today. And how using this tool, because this is basically Paul's schema. And in question form, it's the schema that Paul left, and how you can use this to do an assessment on leaders, on churches, on church networks. You identify those issues and problems here, and then you produce papers, articles aligned with Paul's schemas, but you're drawing forth principles and processes. And we were talking about how we did a parenting one most recently, parenting our children to contend for the TWCA paradigm is an example of that. Okay, so those of you that have been here a week, maybe you thought, man, I should have just showed up today and just did it in 10 minutes rather than take 72
No,
hours.
I'm glad you did this. I had similar stuff in the beginning, but I'm still recovering from James and Isaac being at our place and staying till 1. And
Yeah, James, what are you doing, bro?
No, he left early this time. Yeah.
Yeah, you guys got
And
to...
so I was up till 4,
have
and
to-
so now I can, so I don't have to start slow because I'm kind of waking up and
Okay. I
getting
was gonna
into it
blame
as we
James.
go. But let's, the new guys that are here, Ray, we got Don, we got Chadwick. Did you guys, you got to have these books for the session. You got them? You got them? Good.
Good.
I want to add a couple things. Go back to the slide, Michael, of near the beginning that shows all the color. Yeah, that. I think you mentioned it, but it's important to realize that we don't have these yet, the slipcases. And we've got all the books now a year down the road from last year where they're edited at the top level and everything. But we've got them in these slipcases because we want you to not have 13, 14 booklets hanging all over the place like they're little inductive things, but you're building your body of work. And so that's designed to image that, and you're going to want to cycle through it regularly. The other thing is, again, you mentioned it, but because we're going to hit Gospels this morning, and that is, it's a pretty big decision. You got Paul's early, middle, later letters, and then you've got Jesus to the Gospels and Luke Acts, and you're actually studying those at the time in their context as the books are unfolding in the New Testament. And then when you do the Petrine Circle letters, you're looking at Mark and Matthew. And, you know, we put the four Gospels on the front end of everything, but they were written after most of Paul's and during the same time, you know, as the Petrine Circle, most of them. And even things like Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Why in the world would you start with the hardest book, Matthew, when it was written after Mark, and it assumes that you have the Kerygma framework first and you deepen it as you move through, you know, the biblical study. So, and then we got John here in the Johannine literature. So it's very important to build your framework and put the Gospels in the right place. And you know, there's going to be a final version of these things because we just finished the Petrine Circle. It'll be available a year from now, and then Johannine this year. And they got to go into chapters 8 and 9 in this because you want to be able to follow this integration all the way through. So it, you know, it has to continue to grow with the finishing of it. And we're going to look at the Gospels a bit today. But it's important to realize that was a big decision because the question was always in scope and sequence, after the first principles, where do you put the story? And in scope and sequence, where do you put the Gospels? Mm-hmm. You know, and until we really thought that all the way through, there was a tendency to we just couldn't figure it out, you know, and that became a real issue as we started working large scale in China because they kind of almost start with the Gospels in a way, work with the first half of Acts, and so the whole idea is like we're starting in the wrong places. So anyway, that's an important element of this that sets the tone for this morning a bit too.
Yeah, and that's such a paradigm piece too, because why is our New Testament, we just take for granted the way the New Testament is organized why is it organized that way? Mm-hmm. We don't tend to ask that question. And when you start getting into the schema and you start looking at the canonical parts of the New Testament, then it's a tough question, but you can begin to, I think it begins to get clearer and clearer about the establishment process and why the order of the books in the canonical sections is really important.
Yeah, and it really messes things up, the English Bibles. I mean, the English Old Testament is the law of the prophets and the writings. It's beautifully put together, and then we scramble it all, you know, and then you get to the New Testament.
Which that's what Jesus said in Luke 24.
Yeah.
On the road to Emmaus. He unfolded the law, the prophets, and the Psalms. He says, well, the Psalms is like Ephesians to the middle letters, and like First Peter is to the Petrine Circle. It's the pinnacle book. It's the manifesto book, like Romans is to the early letters. Psalms is the pinnacle book to the writings. But if you don't have that in your head, then you think, oh, Jesus was just explaining some parts of the law, some parts of a few prophets, and he must be explaining Psalm 10. No. He was explaining the whole paradigm of the entire New Testament and how that paradigm needed another piece, which was the high priest forever, which was him. But you can't get there if they're just little leaves on the trees again. And that's the whole hermeneutical crisis that Walt Kaiser was talking about in the 80s, saying we gotta start over, because our colleges, our churches, our whole Christendom is built on the wrong hermeneutic. It's powerful. That's why it's amazing the day we live in. Okay, any other highlights you want to do for the review?
What's that?
Any other highlights for the review before we go into session 5?
No, and I'm pretty much awake.
And you're pretty much awake?
Yeah.
All right. Who do we blame for that? Not you, James. You pointed a finger. Isaac. Okay. All right. I hope he's wearing shorts today.
We had kind of a
That'll only be funny, those of you that
pile
were
of
here yesterday.
people that
Actually, well, no, I won't go into that. I was going to make another joke. Okay. Session 5 is, I just built the chart on it, so I could just show you the chart, but, oh yeah, Paul's letters as tools for building a complex apostolic networks. Paul's tools, Paul's letters as tools.
actually your use of 5 is really led us again into the discussion of why we decided to do it this way. There's a kind of a story, an intro to this in a way of you remember when we were going to the airport in Shanghai, I think it was, and
Yeah, I do.
where it seems like that should,
Be on the front end here?
yeah.
Yeah. So
Why? No. Here's the issue. Why do you think session 5 is so important?
Well, I think this session is the heart of what I think the heart of what our prayer is, that every network around the world in the next 10 years gets their mind around and implements. But why is that? That I didn't answer why, other than I began to just say, when you look across India, and 40 years of this paradigm work in India, a lot of people are doing things up the first curve, which they're training their leaders in the churches. They're starting to meet. Some are starting to meet as churches, as families. They're training all believers. I mean, we just had 5,000 more people get in the last into the first principles in a couple different networks, and they're getting the first principles out there, and people are beginning to understand that there's a going to church as they understood it versus going to church as the New Testament apostles say it is different. But there's 40 years of that. But you begin to see that the only way this paradigm is going to be sustained is if you have networks of churches and you have leaders, elders, and apostolic types and their team that are stirring amongst these networks. They're not going to be able to be sustained. You can't do it in the megachurch model. That's been proven over and over and over again. And people are going to continue to do it and try it, but then when the big guy leaves, it is going to ultimately crumble either in the second or the third generation. It's just we've seen it over and over and over again. Sometimes it happens over an 80-year period. Sometimes it happens over a 25-year period. But so that we can't do that in the second curve. That's not the model, and that's not the model Paul's describing here. So we were in we were in a place in that Asian country that you just mentioned, and we were on the way to the airport, and I was adamant with you in that car ride. What was Paul's leadership decisions that he made in order to build a complex apostolic network? Did he know he was building a complex apostolic network? If he did, how can we have confidence and evidence of what he actually left for us in order to build networks? Because we're trained to build our little churches, to build our churches. And very few people can build a megachurch, but otherwise we want to preach and be a pastor, and we're the biggest beneficiaries of that system. And so we don't want to mess up that system. But Paul was building a complex network and said, once I got these pieces in place, I'm done, and I'm moving on. Well, we all know the work wasn't done. There was endless more problems to solve. But somehow, he felt like the framework was enough in place that it could iteratively grow for 300 years. Now, he didn't know 300 years. He didn't know what was going to happen. But we know historically that's in essence what happened. It continued to spawn itself.
And so how did he make these decisions?
How did he actually do that? All of us want something that lasts past us. All of us. All of us want that. But how can we be confident, and how can we discern what's the hermeneutic to actually chase what Paul was actually doing? In Romans 16, in 1 Corinthians 16, I grew up in a Christian school. I did all sorts of things, and we would read Romans 16, and all we would do is try to make fun of each other because no one could say all the names without messing up. We had no idea what Paul was doing in Romans 16. 1 Corinthians 16. In Colossians, he does a little bit of it. And what is he doing? Listing all those names. And what can we discern from as a normative part of the schema that we can replicate today? That was the conversation in that ride to the
and the reason why this is important, we'll go over it a little bit tomorrow morning, but one of the decisions that we've come to, we cultivated India from 204 to 214, 10 years. And then we started building apostolic network.
But you started going into India in 1980.
But yeah, we started there in 1983. But when the door was open to all the big networks, and we wound up with essentially market share by a majority of them, the issue then is after the cultivation of people use resources, then how do you build complex apostolic networks like Acts? And after a decade, a lot of people can use, like Micah was saying, the first curve and understand our system, but we don't have hardly any examples in India of people building the whole system. It's constantly a mixture of other things. We've cultivated China now for 10 years, and we've learned from that. And of the 38 major networks, again, probably 60, 70% of all the house church movements in China we're working with, one after another, the first 8 are saying, yes, over the next 10 years, we're going to seriously build the complex apostolic network together with you, using the complete system and really building it. First 5 years, you develop your apostolic team, key elders in strategic cities, grassroots first principles, all the way across. We're going to go to the gathering, as a structure. And then Ali was here. I'm going around a particular direction to get to the important points of developing Paul's acumen in building the church networks.
Yeah, Paul's skills, because Paul's acumen.
We've done a lot of the training, but most of our Indian teams don't know how to build complex apostolic networks. They just don't, at this stage. Our system and using resources. And the thing that's become apparent in the last couple years in China is they've got the framework, they built it like Acts, they've gone back to the gathering, they're starting to build networks, But constantly the question is, now that we've structured this and there's a lot of problems, we don't have the ability to solve those problems, to think them through clearly. And Ali put it beautifully while he was here, because now he's got a map all the way across the footprint of Muslims, all the way from North Africa to Indonesia. And he said, you guys have given us and helped us understand the core system, but the engine is apostolic teams. And the engine is apostolic teams that can really think through the issues, build the whole system, not mix it, not just use resources. And so what we've been doing up till now on these few days is, so the question is, when we have a question and answer time, after we've been going through MTS on these every other week Zoom, with all these Chinese leaders, and we go into questions, they say, we don't know, we can ask you, and you give us really helpful answers immediately to the problems that are being faced, but we don't have that ability ourselves, to think that through. And so what the Pauline epistles are designed to do, if we master them in the context of the framework of Acts, if we master them, you will develop the acumen to think through building your networks like Acts, complex apostolic networks, to build them solidly on the fly, since you already have, big networks. Because the apostolic team is the engine. And so if we don't get the engine right, not only understanding, the whole system, but if they don't get the engine right, then, and that's what today is. Today is about how do you, now here's Paul's letters, here's how to use them, here's how to master them. In it are Thessalonians, 1st, 2nd Corinthians that are talking on Romans 16, 1 Corinthians 16, all the stuff he says about the networks. But how do you get to the point of that acumen? So I'm backing through everything that we've done and looking at his decision-making process and how he was viewing things and why he made a lot of the decisions that he did to leave an open door for the gospel, and to go on to Troas, things like that, because it's critical that the problems are solved right in this traditioning process. Otherwise, you're improving things, but you're not building something that's intergenerational and sustainable.
Yeah. Okay.
You better go at it, huh?
Yeah, let's go at it. Although one other thing, as I'm stepping down here, we've said this to the rest of you, but those of you that are new, this is probably up to this point, the most difficult book that we've written. And so, complex book. But I will tell you, it's, again, as you can maybe tell from the introduction here, it is the most, as far as building according to as leaders of leaders, to build according to Paul's schema and the apostles' schema, as we get the Petrine and Johannine in here, I think it's the most critical one. It may take you years and years, it may take you 10 years to process it, but it's be patient, and it's worth it. We've been at it for 10 years here, doing it here locally, working through it every week. That's why when I always make comments like, how many months? 10? 10 months? So we're pretty work hard at it and be disciplined at it. But those of you that are your first exposure, just grab one or two or three things that you're learning, and that's good for a session. All right, let's go. I'm going to go sit down there.
Okay, Michael went through a number of these things with the collection, envisioning first principles to mastering the scriptures. And those are biblical concepts. Paul started with first principles, and he said to Timothy, now you're a master craftsman. And so we followed his process. all the way through. I'm going to skip all. Well, what I want to say about this is that when you go from the framework that these are tools for establishing churches, and you go through Paul's early, middle, and later letters, within that framework, then you go to the benchmarks that come out of carefully following his arguments and the key literary sections, the hunks in each of those sections and letters as they unfold. You can quickly look and see where the holes are. And then so we come to the real issue of doing theology and culture, which we majored on yesterday, where you assess issues and problems that need to be addressed. This is often comprehensive, especially for your network of churches, like the paradigm papers, the encyclicals, the global dialogue papers, and then whatever you find that is a problem or a hole, you have to line, redesign, or create new ministries in your church networks. Now, in terms of using the tool, and actually this afternoon when we do 6 and 7, we're really going to major on how to use the system as a whole and how to build on the foundation so that you're not only solving the problems, but you've got the resources you need to build on top of your own body of work to deal comprehensively with the issues and problems in your own cultural setting. But let's talk about this idea of developing network acumen. See, when Michael keeps saying, a number of you have mastered the first curve, you're mastering our system, and our system's complete now, and it will deliver if you know what you're doing. If you're really building a solid apostolic team, that's the engine. Because you've heard us say many times through the years that materials don't train leaders, leaders train leaders. And the materials won't build networks, apostolic teams will build networks. And again, we find ourselves in a situation where you're flying a 747, it's already in the air, and you really don't master the Pauline letters. And so you can't think like Paul if you don't do that. And Paul was a steward of the design of Christ for the church, both revealing his grand strategy, and as the Spirit came and unfolded the Great Commission, actually in his letters, putting the full color into Acts in a way that, because it's situational, that you actually learn to be able to function in your situations on the spot in many cases. So where does this come from? Bill, you asked an interesting question yesterday. Bill said, we know how everything has unfolded. We know how this thing is built, where you have the framework, you have the benchmarks, all right out of the letters, followed by Petrine and Johannine, building on the core of Paul. We know that you can actually now turn section by section these things into questions which you have, and the questions are actually flavored exactly out of the text. So walking in the Spirit is not just a magical thing. Walking in the Spirit is walking in Galatians in the sphere of the faith that has been delivered, that the Spirit operates within. It's not a magical on and off kind of light switch. So you got the questions there, but then the issue becomes, I get into this section, and you're going to look at Paul's decision-making, the problems that he solved in the early, middle, and later letters, and then you're going to look at his reasoning. So we see what he did in building his network. We see him leave the wide open door for the gospel in 2 Corinthians 12 to 14. We see him sending this person here. We see him threatening the Corinthians with a big stick. How did he make the decisions that he made? I mean, and so what I did was, in this one, catalog the problems and then look at what he knew, what he must have known in his mind to have made that decision. because he doesn't always tell you that. You see the decision. But actually, when you put it all together, and this is what we're calling the Pauline Apostolic Network schema, the framework that's there in his head, but it's really also what he calls the mind of Christ several times all the way through. Because he says, even at the tradition level of the Lord's Supper around the meal, he says, I'm handing on to you what I received from Christ. So, people get nervous when we talk so much about Paul and the strategy and the acumen that we left Jesus, he's back in the Gospels, and that's the beginning of the Old Testament anyway. Well, it's not the beginning of the Old Testament, and Acts is what Jesus continued to do and teach, and Paul was the steward for making clear what Christ's grand strategy was, even in how to establish churches. So that it's a false dichotomy to even raise that question. But I know it'll come up strong because, and here, you see, I'm going to go through the problems, and you can say, okay, those are the problems in the early, middle, laters, I see that. But then you go to what he knew. And so then you ask the question, and this is kind of what Bill asked, what's your criteria? How did you get those? I think you'll see that they're very, very helpful. And you'll see that a lot of our apostolic teams, that even with going through the resources, don't think like this. And you have to get the ability and capacity to think like this. But what was your criteria? And I thought about that all night, because I kind of just instinctive. I told Bill, I think the criteria is that it was just instinctive. Well, that's comforting, that what was instinctive, you made the highlight, of this. But I think the answer to the question is, if you really know Paul's early and middle, later letters, and you really know the traditioning process, and you've paid attention to those sections like Romans 16 when he's directing traffic everywhere in his network, and all of Romans 16, all of 1 Corinthians 16, the end of a lot of the letters, and then big fights. The whole thing in 1st, 2nd Corinthians is basically an argument with the churches at Corinth in how to solve the problems. So you see, if you understand that, you can step away from it and say, what was he thinking? And it becomes clear. So it's not instinctive. It's actually, if you master that stuff, this is what you'll recognize of how you would think in developing what comes at you in the apostolic network. So I'm calling it developing network acumen, Paul's philosophy and principles in action in his early, middle, later letters. And we've turned this into an assessment guide as well. So when we're talking about complex apostolic network schema, you're all familiar with this. You got your apostolic team, the 4 component parts in encyclical 2. You've got your key hubs in Ephesus, Antioch, and Rome. You've got your clusters, and the cluster is illustrated beautifully, even how to do theology and culture with Colossae, and then the issue around Philemon and Onesimus, and then you've got the other 2 churches, Laodicea and Hierapolis in the Lycus Valley, and a beautiful picture. Then you've got the spontaneous expansion that's taking place, and usually around a key church like Philippi that continues to build out. So this is the broad schema, but so within the framework of this, and that's what I was saying, the question that comes up consistently in the Chinese situation is, okay, we got the framework in place, and this is very exciting. And in many cases, all the house church movements started in the first half of Acts, then things were opened up, and the West came in, and it didn't work, and now they're really learning Paul and the second half, of Acts. But the question is, now we got that framework in place, how do we develop fast enough when we've got thousands of churches that are in our network and under our care? Okay, so the complex apostolic network schematic. We are part of Christ's grand strategy that continues to unfold to this day all around the world, with the expectation of continuing in the apostolic traditioning of Paul and keeping all his component parts intact from generation to generation. Very, very difficult, but that's what Paul expected. What he did to the churches, he said to Timothy, now you have the same concern for the churches. It's in generation, and the generation after that. And when you look into the household family structure, you have the older women helping the younger women because of the intergenerational motivation of handling their families correctly, so this continues to multiply. This demands that key apostolic leaders develop a comprehensive strategy based primarily on Acts and Pauline letters, evangelizing strategic cities, establishing networks of churches around those cities, and entrusting them to local leadership. These leaders and their co-workers must keep a balance between strengthening the clusters and networks of churches, especially when cracks begin to emerge, to an ever-expanding network, both regionally and to entirely new spheres. In other words, you have to continue to strengthen them when cracks come into the network, like the Corinthian church. You've got to solve those cracks, even walking away from open doors in the gospel, because everything will collapse if you don't solve those. But if you sit around and solve things until everything's perfect, you lose the moment, you don't take the risks and keep expanding, keep moving, keep pushing. And I think that what you mentioned, Michael, if there's nothing else to do, you know, Steve, you've seen that. Where's Steve Gallagher? Oh, hi, Steve. Where he's actually worked in the area of Illyricum, from Jerusalem to Illyricum, you know, and seen it firsthand. I've been there in that situation with Steve. And because Paul, lots of problems to solve yet, but he's going further, and he's saying to the Corinthians, shape up, because I've been given a sphere in a field, and if you don't shape up, we're not going to be able to fulfill the stewardship that God's given us of expansion. So there's got to be aggressive expansion, but there's got to be a balance in making sure that those cracks are dealt with. An apostolic team of co-workers with a long-term track record of trusted service must be identified locally and deployed as needed. These are the Timothy Titus types, key men and women benefactors and their co-workers. Strong churches must be established in all the key cities of regions and countries to serve as hubs in order for churches to spontaneously expand throughout the region, and for a network of churches to develop stable strength so clusters of churches can become strong and multiply. Spontaneous expansion can't happen until the core of the network is solid. That's why we're now what we're doing, and we'll return to it tomorrow morning, is we're saying to church networks that are partnering with us all over the world, you can continue to use our resources, we'll continue to work with you, but what we're looking for in this next 10 years is apostolic team leaders, especially the very key leaders of networks, sometimes massive networks, to make a decision of whether you're going to work with us to build the whole paradigm using our system. 5 years building the foundation, and 5 years stewarding the spontaneous expansion, the framework of the spontaneous expansion. The network story and existing master strategy, the apostolic traditioning of Paul, must be part of the process of entrusting future key apostolic leaders not only to deal with the cracks in the network, but also for acknowledging key apostolic team co-workers and strategic expansion planning. And that's what 2 Timothy is all about. 2 Timothy is all about creating what Paul, the replication of what Paul created. That's why it's not like a Western organization with all the rules and everything that's done. It's this process of moving from schema to principles to processes to practice that was all laid down in Christ's grand strategy revealed by Paul, or through Paul. And so that's got to be intergenerational. The apostolic team and apostolic authority is one of the hardest concepts, if we've been infiltrated at all by the West, to get into our heads. Then the question becomes, if you see Paul and his team exercising apostolic authority, and that's how things were solved, are we supposed to do that? And so we start out timidly saying, okay, we'll call them Paulines. But apostolic authority, because of the evangelical Pentecostal fight that's gone on for 4 or 5 decades, we can't see clearly. But apostolic authority established by Paul in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and then really made perpetual in how he instructed Timothy to pick up his functions, is absolutely critical. If we don't have that idea, we can't succeed. I'll guarantee you just can't succeed in building according to Christ's strategy. Now, Paul developed incredible network acumen. Maybe and might be troubling to some of you, but I think it's how, when you look at Peter, you remember Peter, he had the core gospel in his 5 messages in Acts. And the formulae, like when he was with Cornelius and gave that short sermon, and then in 1 Corinthians 15 to 1 to 6, Paul had that core gospel formulae, and then expanded it through his letters. But remember, even though Peter had it, and Paul checked with the apostles, for them to affirm it, and they had that core, Peter was confused about a lot of the Gospels. And you can see that in Galatians 2. So there's a progression and a growth in these apostles. The Spirit is stewarding the whole thing. But the letters are so situational, and even the growth of somebody like Peter, because when you do the Petrine Circle letters at the end, Peter writes 1 Peter, just like Paul's manifesto in Ephesians, and he's now got the whole picture. But he didn't have lot of the whole picture along the way. So what about Paul? Did Paul have this whole acumen that I'm going to show you here? Did Paul have all that? Did the Spirit just zap him and he's got it? Now, I theorize that he learned it painfully in the process and the Spirit stewarded it. How do you know that? 2 Corinthians 1. Paul's depressed to the point of death. I'm done. And then he comes into Troas, and there's a wide open door for the gospel. But he was wrenched in his spirit, very strong words here. And he hadn't heard from Titus and how they responded to Paul beating up on the Corinthian churches. So he leaves a wide open door for the gospel. But it's real. If he just knew how to think perfectly and he wasn't in a development process himself, why would he be depressed? Why would he be back and forth? What do I do in this situation? And following it then on the trip to Troas is one of the most beautiful perspective of ministry sections anywhere. 2:12 to 7:5, conflicts without and fears within, and what the triumphal march is. Out of that crucible, he began to see that. Now we can see it and look back and reflect out of the crucible of our own situation. So maybe he knew this early on, this incredible network acumen. Maybe he knew this early on, but I think it probably developed significantly as he encountered problem after problem. He obviously had much of the understanding of the church before writing the middle letters, because he's reviewing some things there. And he clearly knew much about the social structure of establishing churches before writing the letters, but his incredible network acumen must have grown day by day as he could see more and more clearly as he grew older. Oh yeah, remember that section? Right, same thing in 2 Corinthians. As I grow older, my body's deteriorating, but I'm seeing more clearly day by day. So he was in the development process, just like you are. But we've got the map, we've got the framework, we've got the letters, but we have to go at it because we're an apostolic team and senior elders particularly anchoring the network, soto moto. And if we don't have that same passion and we don't go after it, then yeah, we'll solve a few problems and we'll be closer to the New Testament, but we're not going to create something intergenerationally that's going to turn the world upside down, that's going to turn China upside down, or with the Lee that's going to turn the Muslim world, upside down. Okay, so what did Paul see? Well, see, Paul saw the need to establish churches, and you say, now where did you get this? Well, in one sense, it's just basic. It's right out of those passages, and in one sense, You almost have it naturally if you do everything up through session 4. But there's something about looking at it like this that helps you assess, particularly if you're a Paul-type leader, and usually the Pauls are kind of have a combination like Paul of apostle, prophet, and teacher, and they have apostolic team people, co-workers, young Timothys and Tituses, etc., that they're using and developing. So maybe this is a list for the 2 or 3 top leaders to be able to assess whether you're actually building a team that's going to be able to do the job, that they got the right perspectives. Paul saw the need to establish churches in the gospel before he could move forward with a solid base. All his early letters are completely focused on that. He saw the ministry correctly, conflicts without and fears within. How many people just get completely off track where if there's problems, we're not doing something right, and success is a big church with no problems. We get the whole thing upside down. Paul knew he could not move into new, even wide open doors for the gospel if there were major cracks in his key churches. He knew he could not allow anything to be added to the gospel, nothing. He would fight whomever he needed to fight over this issue, Galatians being one of the harshest letters. He knew he had to have a very strong team of young apostolic leaders, young lieutenants. Thus, he replaced John Mark with Timothy very early on because he couldn't have a crack that big that the person would turn around. Now, that doesn't mean that he wasn't useful because remember Paul's last winter before he died in 68, when he's assembling the collection of his letters, Luke is there, and John Mark, he asks for John Mark too, because John Mark was a steward of what was unfolding with the Petrine Circle letters, and particularly a key person at that stage then to Peter. He knew his network would not become a true movement if he did not get the blessings of the apostles in Jerusalem, so he sought a consensus even though he knew they did not fully understand what he was doing. This one I'm not sure of. I've gone over and over these collections, but we've practiced this because when we're invited into a network of churches, and let's say there's somebody excited in that network, they've got a hold to build resources, and they want to start building. We will not go in and build that unless we've sat down with the top leadership. And I think that's kind of what this is about. In other words, even though the Jerusalem church, with its key apostolic leaders, even though that Jerusalem church didn't understand the whole picture, they thought the unfolding would still be in the remnant of the true remnant of Israel, and actually opposed Paul's expanding into the Gentiles. Still, Paul knew that the roots were there, and whatever he was building, he would do everything he could to make sure that they affirmed and the schism didn't get broader. And in fact, the purpose of his big collection in 1 Corinthians 16, 1-5, and all of 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 was to begin to bridge that gap, to meet real needs, but to bridge that gap of the church that was unfolding. So in a way, by us saying we're going to prioritize those who want to build the whole paradigm, then others will continue to come along as those things are developed. But at the same time, I believe because networks that come to us as major networks that are developed all across the global south, we have to pay attention to not being invited in the side door to a network or sticking our nose under the tent from the side. We have to be able to sit down with those leaders and do everything we can to build. But I'm still not happy with how this one's worded. I'm happy with all the rest of them, but I'm not completely happy with that. Also, he knew the importance of his base at Antioch. And these things are so important. And through the years, people have said, man, you got such wide open doors. Why are you still messing around with a small network of churches in a cornfield in Iowa? It's because you're not going to build something intergenerational if you don't keep all the component parts there. And so we've got a whole third generation emerging right now. You heard from a couple of them yesterday. And that's because we know the importance of the base at Antioch, the base that God has given us. You've heard the story, but one of our conferences, we had a number of big churches there. And in that conference, I was invited to move into 3 different situations: a huge church in Des Moines, one of the large churches in Minneapolis, and one in Dallas. And they would help professionalize our team. They would help support us. We didn't even consider it because of a few of these things that we knew had to be there. He knew he needed to establish his new groups of believers as duly recognized gatherings, so he quickly appointed elders. You remember that whole work we did on the gathering and duly appointed, and what gatherings were like, at that time, the assemblies, even in the culture. So they had to be duly recognized. These just weren't small groups, they were duly recognized churches. Now, and he knew he had to establish the churches in the gospel, so he wrote about conflicts around the gospel in his letters. He knew benefactors were key to his apostolic team, so he brought them in and trusted them with key responsibilities. We're in a tension right now because we've emphasized strongly peer-led youth leading peers, and reaching their peers. And it's always the case. But the idea of entrusting them with key responsibilities is driving some parents nuts. Well, Paul, think about that. Timothy is highly spoken of by at least 2 churches, and Paul wants him to go with them. And he's probably 17 or 18. A year or 2 later, he sends Timothy down to Thessalonica with a letter saying, I sent Timothy with this letter for you to understand it and to help establish you. But what if the elders there had said, well, Paul, we don't think anybody's going to really be able to shepherd Timothy like here. And so we don't think you should, you get the parallel, it's phenomenal. We start thinking narrow, but yet Paul was careful to train senior elders 3 years, night and day in Ephesus, in a strategic city. But he was using Timothy probably as a teenager, but had the right gifts to send down in the context of this. He knew that relationships with the churches and his growing apostolic team were critical, so he devoted significant time, especially in the end of his letters, to personalizing relationships between his team and the key churches. And the more you examine that, you can see Sodal Modal in it. Because he had to have the key leaders of those emerging Colossae churches really committing to him and the network that's building. And you see the theology arguing between Paul and Onesimus and his master, Philemon. And so you see that back and forth, tons of material on personalizing the relationships. It really drives most of Philippians, if you think about it. There's no new big theology in Philippians. There's no new big theology in Thessalonian letters and in 2 Corinthians. There is in Galatians. There is in Romans. There is in the manifesto dual of Ephesians and Colossians. But there's entire letters, let alone the end of certain letters, that give us great insight into that relationship. He knew churches needed to follow Christ's design and multiply, so he created a framework for the gathering that would allow the Spirit freedom to work and thus easily, spontaneously multiply. So you say, wait a minute, now, are you sure that this is another one that people stumble over. Paul created a framework. Isn't it the Spirit? Well, yeah, the Spirit created the framework. That's the whole idea, but they're revealing it through Paul. And so Paul, in the culture of his day, which was built around an ideal city and family household texts, because the wisdom tradition of the Greeks was really moving forward, but Paul actually created that context and gave illustrations and guidelines for how to solve the problem so we get a complete picture. But it's what the Spirit was doing. I can just imagine Paul saying, what am I going to do with the Corinthians? Because now they're stratified. It's just like a caste system. The older people, the wealthy people won't eat with them. They're suing each other. And then he crystallizes the gathering so you can see the core function and why it's absolutely essential to begin there. He knew, where am I? He knew that. We're done with this one? Yeah, that was good. Okay, the middle letters. Paul knew churches had to grasp the significance of their central role in the grand strategy in order to experience the full power available to them. Remember, he goes back over the manifesto in Ephesians. He bookends it with two prayers. And the second prayer is primarily that they would just be gripped with an understanding of the significance of the church right at the heart of Christ's plan. So he knew that it wasn't okay for them to just understand it. They had to be overwhelmed by it. They had to grip it. They had to have a passion and understand the significance that they are now at the very center of Christ's plan. Otherwise, there would be no power available. And that, you've heard the illustrations here of the fact that if you don't grasp this, and almost all the churches in the West don't grasp it, at this stage, and you've just got one key leader doing everything and everybody else sitting and maybe some evangelism programs here and there, it's like you're operating at 10% power in comparison to whether we put things in action like what he talks about in Ephesians, where the work of the ministry is in the hands of the saints. And when we all work together, Christ shines and even the world can just see Christ. That's 100 power. That's what he's 100% power. That's what he's praying for. He knew that one-mindedness was critical to the progress of the gospel. So he dealt carefully and openly with the need for one-mindedness. Tell Euodia and Syntyche to knock it off. Imagine the letters read and you're Euodia and Syntyche, in that situation. Couldn't you have been a little nicer about that? He knew he had to expand his base by establishing hubs and clusters and developing strategic partner churches to build a network infrastructure in the churches. He knew he needed to broaden his team extensively to fully establish the churches. He knew he needed flexibility in his life situation, so he developed his tent-making business and solicited others to partner with him in it. How do you know that? Because he says that's what he did with the tent making, so he wouldn't be a burden on the Corinthian churches. Remember that section? He knew gifts from key churches were important, so he encouraged it and praised those who partnered with him. Big section, two big sections in Corinth and the Philippians. He knew key churches had assets. Needed to progress the gospel and establish the churches, so he sought the assistance from key members to participate on his team. And so there were the leaders that he trained that solidified and stabilized the churches, and like a new network like Titus on the island of Crete, made sure there were at least senior elders that had a firm grasp for the teaching. But when you read through 1 Corinthians 16, Romans 16, you read through Philippians that were participating with him, it wasn't just the gifts. It was Epaphroditus, it was Euodia and Syntyche. So they were key workers in helping it expand in the local area spontaneously, but they were key workers on his team and traveled with him at different times. And he knew man, I got to quit turning around. I can't figure. He knew he needed flexibility. He knew gifts for him. He knew the churches had a jeez. He knew he needed to teach his churches to think carefully through issues on the foundation of the kerygma and didache, so he brought issues into the open in his letters. And that's what his letters were all about. And finally, Paul knew even key hub churches would have problems maintaining one-mindedness within the elders. So he laid out careful qualifications for elders and deacons and leading women, and included significant instruction in his fine letters how to keep them one-minded. You remember when he spent 3 years night and day with the key elders in Ephesus, and his final goodbye, he said, some of you aren't going to make it. Then he leaves Timothy in Ephesus, in 1 Timothy, to deal with the elders that are out of line and appoint new ones. There's some kind of ongoing modal balance within that. So again, he knew that was the case. He predicted it, and it's what happened. He knew the importance of properly ordering young networks around the household social structure according to Jesus' design, so he used the household codes, the schemas of the day, to build a tradition of establishing churches around that schema. He knew apostolic teams and networks of churches needed to continue to grow strong and multiply after his death. So he ordered his manuscripts to create an intergenerational process for their continued growth and multiplication. That's why he had the big powwow in the winter before he lost his head in the spring of 68. The more you look at the manuscripts, who was there, you can see the picture. He was fully aware of emerging cracks in his network that would be problems after his death, so he developed a serious ordered learning around his letters and to create an intergenerational process of developing apostolic teams and networks of churches. 2 Timothy 2:2 is not about a silly little Western individualistic discipleship program, but it's about serious intergenerational development as the leadership moved from one generation to the next. And he realized the critical nature of preparing an intergenerational process for generations of young apostolic leaders who would carefully assume and carry out his apostolic functions after his death. Now, after Paul wrote his 4 middle letters and was released from prison, we can learn a lot by examining the final activities. And we do this on a chart of these activities in Titus 4 and 5. The core of his strategy was Asia Minor. The heart of his final strategy was Ephesus. While he touched on his early network foundations in the Galatian region during this time and spent time laying foundations for Rome and laying foundations in Spain for the next phase of the expansion after his death, his core focus was on Ephesus and Southeast Asia. And consult the maps several times. To see this as you build your 5-year strategy. What's interesting, we've now got this really tight sheet of what it means to make a commitment to this whole process, a solid commitment. But when you go back here, we kind of instinctively knew it because you're laying that 5-year foundation, which is what we're doing in that first 5 years. So sometimes we're a year or two off, maybe a 3-year strategy or 5-year strategy. But okay, now, what I did was went through the same thing as before. Doing well, slight problem, major problem. I'm not going to read through them all. Well, let's see whether it gets boring. Complex apostolic network schema, 4 component parts. Are they building the network structure around the 4 parts? Strong apostolic team, solid hubs as modeled in Ephesus, solid clusters modeled in the Lycus Valley churches, and solid strategic churches. The early letters, do they see the need for establishing churches in the gospel? Do they see the ministry correctly, conflicts without and fears within? In other words, you can see Paul's decisions and his mental acumen. Now you got to evaluate your team and say, do they understand this? Do they think like this? It's one thing to evaluate your network of churches, but the engine is the team. And so if you don't build the team, you can't succeed at this. But if you don't build the team to think right, then you're still going to have problems. So that's what I think this is for. There's always a core team, whether they understand apostolic networks, an apostolic authority or not, or even apostolic teams or not. You look all across China, all the way into across Asia, to the church planting movements in India, to Africa, to Latin America. Anytime we look at networks of churches that are first generation, which is the dominant growth of 1 billion people, let's say, across the global south, you almost always have a core team. You have somebody that's like a Paul and 2 or 3 people around him. And then there's usually a broader sphere of 8 to 12. And then there's usually about 35 as the network. It's just amazing how consistent it is. So this probably is a guide initially for that key leader and the 2 or 3 people around him. But as you expand it, you keep having to ask the question, particularly as you develop hubs and clusters. And do they see the need to establish churches in the gospel before they can move on? Do they see the ministry correctly? Conflicts out and fears within. Paul learned that the hard way because Timothy, remember, he said he's the only one that isn't after his own self-interest. And all through 2 Timothy and 1 Timothy, you see people dropping off overboard, that were close to them. Do they know that they cannot move into new, even wide open doors if there are major cracks? Do they know they cannot allow anything to be added to the gospel and they'll fight over it? Do the teams know they need to have strong apostolic lieutenants? We got numbers of large ministry networks, and the oldest person like me is getting old, all right? And there's really nobody on the horizon. Or you have an India situation, they solve the problem by giving it to their son. We have all kinds of shortcuts. I'm not saying that never can be passed on to a son, but what I'm saying is that all these networks, you look across the board, and not only do they not have apostolic teams that can think like this in most cases, but they haven't really prepared the next generation. Timothy was under Paul for a 20-year period. He was given responsibility a lot very quick. But he was under Paul for 20 years before Paul said, I'm on my way out, and now, you're a master craftsman. And if you don't have that kind of framework going on, then what's going to happen to the stewardship, to the networks of churches that you have been stewarding if you're covering this at the last minute? Do they know their network would not become a true movement if they did not get the blessing of the denomination or parents? A lot of times the young bucks get all around the resources and they take off and they're mad at and almost create a schism. Now it doesn't mean that in the process of that the network won't back up or there won't be schisms or that sort of thing, but do they know they need to establish new groups of believers as duly recognized gatherings as appointing elders quickly? This is another one of the battles in China because you hear about the China House Church movement. And to a number of them, before Chairman Xi came in and busted up, they wanted to build big churches like the West, but the second thing is they build house churches, house church movement. But you know what a house church is? A house church has about 200 people. And then the small ones that are 10 to 15 or 25, they're small groups. Don't call them churches because you got to have a base of about 200 to be, a house church. That's common. And that's changing. These networks that have said yes to us, the 8 so far of the 38, and we think almost all of them are going to say yes, understand this and are beginning to counter that. But when Paul gathered them together, he circled back around. He didn't leave them alone. The key ones he would train night and day for a period of 3 years, but quickly he constituted them into churches and appointed elders. And again, it's really a problem for established elderships to think narrowly and cautiously and not turn things over quickly and continue to develop until you're so safe that everything's boring and nothing spontaneously expands. Do they know they need to establish their new groups of believers as duly? Oh, jeez. Do they know they need to establish the churches fully in Paul's gospel and that they will experience similar conflicts as Paul did in his letters? Do they know that benefactors are key to the apostolic team and they need to bring them in and trust them with key responsibilities? Do they know that relationships between churches and their growing apostolic team is critical and they need to devote significant time to personalizing key relationships with their teams and the key leaders? Do they know they have to create a framework for the gathering in order for the churches to follow Christ's design and to allow the Spirit freedom to work and thus easily multiply? Do they know the churches have a grasp? Do they know their churches have a grasp of the significance of their central role in the grand strategy in order to experience the full power available to them? Do they know that one-mindedness is critical to the progress of the gospel, and they need to deal carefully and openly with the need for that one-mindedness? Do they know they need to expand their base by establishing hubs and clusters and by developing strategic partner churches to build the network infrastructure? And do they know they need to broaden their team extensively to fully establish the churches? Do they know they need to be flexible in their life situations, develop tent-making businesses as needed, and maybe solicit others to partner with them? Do they know that the gifts from key churches are important and they need to encourage giving as well as praising those who partner with them? Do they realize key churches have assets needed to progress the gospel and establish the churches? And do they seek assistance from key members to participate with them on their team? Do they know they need to teach churches to carefully think through issues on the foundation of the kerygma and didache? And do they model it by sending letters and people, really, to deal with those? And do they realize even key hub churches will have problems maintaining one-mindedness within the elders? And do they seek to assist in appointing and correcting elders, deacons, and leading women? Well, you can't do that if you didn't lay the foundation right. If the elders don't understand sodal modal and that there's a complementary yin-yang, if you would, related to the two of those, then you don't have a corrective process. But if the elders can't shepherd because of the control, then you have problems on the other side. Do they know the importance of properly ordering young networks around the household social structure according to Jesus' design, using the household codes to build a tradition of establishing churches around the schema? Do they know there is a system? When you look at the Old Covenant and the system that God built, and then the New Covenant and the entrance into that New Covenant in the gathering and the Lord's Supper, and then the household order, the administration of Christ, the grand strategy of Christ, which is all laid out, it's a system. It's a framework schema system, and there's a set of principles that drive it and some processes, but we can create a lot of processes and practices within that framework. It is actually a system. Sometimes people, when they encounter our complete system, think, well, you're doing the job of the Holy Spirit. No, the Holy Spirit gave us a system, and it's how He works. And that's oftentimes because people want to do whatever they want to do, and so they magically call everything something that the Spirit's doing, with no way of being able to validate it. It's important. Do they know the importance of serious ordered learning around the Pauline corpus to create an intergenerational process of developing apostolic teams and networks of churches, watching out for larger network cracks? He exhorts Timothy very strongly. Physical discipline is important, but your discipline in continuing to progress in this sound doctrine that has been delivered and the stewardship that you're being given, Paul expected. Do they realize the critical nature of preparing a next generation of young apostolic leaders like Timothy and the need to carefully assume and carry out apostolic functions for the next generation? You know, when we say things like our challenge to you as India partners, and we have a majority of the large movements, most of the movements are not seriously doing even that last question. Because you can't do it when you've realized, ooh, I might only have a year or two left because of the stints they're putting in. I mean, these things have to be taken very seriously or the fruit will not continue. And the problem is a lot of the movements were stimulated by saturation church planting and CPMs. They're flat. They don't understand hubs and clusters. They don't understand apostolic teams. And the money's attached to the expansion of this flat thing that's been created. Or a number of them were kind of started or overseen by kind of a church growth parachurch sort of thing that keeps them clustered together and keeps them living. And because that's kind of how it grew, it's a ton of work to build this into something that's already big. Now, as far as the discussion questions, is this the end? Yeah, this is the end. How do Paul's letters complete Acts by giving full insight into the mental acumen needed to design strategies that were consistent with Christ's grand strategy, and which his church was being the center of that expansion and kingdom? Beginning, and I guess this is how I developed these, beginning with the complex apostolic schema designed from Acts, how do our observations of Paul's network acumen fill out that taxonomy in a way as key apostolic leaders under the guidance of the Spirit can develop the same network acumen today that we in our apostolic teams need to build networks? Over a 5-year period, how do we initially design, align, and realign our master strategy for the building of strategic hubs and aggressively expanding our complex apostolic networks? And what core elements need to be at the center of that master strategy as we shape our networks in order to have impact as the church in our civilization and to have impact in shaping the church in emerging Christendom? Okay. Again, it's the same standard question, Michael. I mean, how many times have you heard this? How many times have we discussed it? But what stands out from this presentation?
What stands out is what was new to me this time was I don't know quite how to word it. These are the activities. You see what Paul did, but go back to the beginning. How did Paul make these decisions? How did we know he made these decisions? But what became clear to me on this one was if we develop Paul's traditioning process, the mind of Christ, we have to hold up in our mind a handful of these things, and then that then goes into all these decisions that he made. In other words, I drew a little picture here, but you said we are part of a grand strategy, hold the Pauline cycle in our minds, the balance of establishing and expanding, co-workers with a long track record, young, strong churches as hubs, and a network strategy that contains intergenerational leaders. So if we hold those...
Oh, that's at the beginning.
Right. Yeah. That's, to me, what I never thought of it this way, but those are topos topic statements. Mm-hmm. They have a whole constellation of things around each statement, but they're a jam-packed topos statement. And if you can hold those things in your head... then you get to these leadership decisions that you went through mm-hmm. in sentence form and then question form.
Yeah.
Which to me it's a whole, again, it's if you can hold up the big core hub pieces or topos ideas, then you can get to all these more, these aren't particulars, but these are you can see these strewn throughout all the letters.
Right, and actually, the reason why this is here at the beginning, the complex network schema of the parts, go all the way back to the simple church to complex network.
Yep.
You know, the component
Yep.
parts. In other words,
Right here.
Yeah. So you're saying that really, if you hold these in your head,
Hold that one in your head. Now go back. That's in your head, and go back. Go way back. Those. You hold these in your head.
Yeah.
Then if you hold those in your head, again, as the topos, you can begin to now go through all the early, middle, and later letters and see why he made those decisions. Because I think, Jeff, our tendency is, go to the early slide, or right here. Yeah, two more. The other way. There you go.
Oh yeah.
Our tendency is here. Think of yesterday. Think of the left column. What we would typically do if you were going to make this into a sermon is you attach a verse to the number one. You attach a verse. And then you attach a verse to all these. But what I heard you doing was you were attaching a whole bunch of different paragraphs of verses or arguments from multiple different sections to each one. Mm-hmm. So you are. This is again. These are. It's not a linear process as much as it's a building up of your mind in order to think in the schema and the principles that undergird it. That's becoming clearer and clearer in my mind.
Yeah, you know, we almost, and it's just consistent. I mean, it's almost like I kept asking myself the question this time through, especially after Bill's criteria thing: is this redundant? Developing Paul's mental acumen is a problem immediately when you put the framework everywhere, which is the China problem that I was describing. How do you know what to think in between? And then, but I'm asking myself, session 5, Paul's letters as tools. Well, these are tools. What really session 5 should say is Paul's letters as tools for building your apostolic team, because that's what we're talking about here. In other words, here's for establishing your churches and solving the problems and moving across it. But really what we're doing here is saying Paul's team, the key leader in Paul's team has to think like this.
And it's the core activities that they're about.
Yeah.
It's the way they prioritize their life, too. That's another thing that was becoming clearer. We got to take a break, but everyone has a prioritization of time problem, and what levers they're going to prioritize and pull in their lifetime. And I think this too, this gives you a life prioritization as well. As you're building apostolic teams and your coworkers, that's the same thing. These are the things that Paul prioritized. All right, let's take a break. Think of, while you're taking a break, be productive. Think of one or two things that you learned. We're going to come back, pass the microphone around, and see one or two things you learned. All right, see you in a little bit. And lots of good conversations happening, I see and hear. But what's one or two things that you learned in this session? One or two things. Zach, you got the microphone? Yep. All right. One or two things you're learning. George, let's just start right with you. You got to open up the gate right up here. Zach, right here. George has been around for quite some time, but has been wrestling with these ideas in earnest for 5 years. Is that fair?
Yeah. So the last 2 days, things were building up. I mean, slowly, some form of clarity was coming, but not fully clear. I think today's really opened up the whole idea to me, at least, especially with the mind of Paul, how he was operating, what framework he was using, and that he was having the mind of Christ, and it was Christ who was leading him in developing networks, developing apostolic leaders, dealing with problems, cracks, other things. All of this, he had developed an acumen, a way of working and thinking, which was a work of the Spirit, which Christ built into his mind. And in his schema and in his all that he has written, he is presenting it to us so that we too can operate and think and work out things similarly in our networks, in our generation, in our churches and culture.
What part about this morning, can you point to any particular part that made that clearer?
Yeah, so there is a couple of slides backward. There was one slide on network acumen.
Okay.
This was just few sentences that seemed to fully open the ideas to me.
Yeah, it is a good phrase too. That it captures Paul's network acumen. He just even that phrase implies he had one. He developed one. Jorge, right here. You gonna do it in English?
Well, let's try. The fourth question is interesting question. What core element we need to at the center of our master strategy? I think that core elements, we need good elders, good apostolic team, benefactors, build a great team, young guys like this guy that we have here, and a clear understanding that the church is the instrument that God wants to use to develop or fulfill his plan. It's impossible to reach all these things without this kind of person. Elder, apostolic team, young guys, benefactor, K-women too, to reach this. It's impossible get this level without this person united, working together.
Great insight. Glad you captured that, Jorge. Jorge gets he gets the most points in the last 3 days. And remember, everything is a competition. It is. And I've been handing out really good points for years, and they are very, very valuable. These are all true statements, so I think Jorge has given insight all week. Brian, right here. Oh, yeah, either one. Kathleen?
Kathleen.
Yeah, great.
Thank you. I think when you started out, Jeff, and you spoke about the decision-making of Paul, I think that struck a chord with me. And the idea later on that was picked up in his early letters about conflicts without and fears within. And my own perspective on Paul has always been the realism that's built into, or the transparency that's built into many of his letters about his wrestlings in ministry and sometimes his personal struggles. I think that, to me, is very grounding, so that this sort of masterful decision-making that emerges from Paul is there, but it's not without levels and layers of realism and, sometimes the inner struggle. What it, in application for me, it means sometimes the interpersonal struggles that we encounter in life and ministry are not antithetical to the actual working through of divine processes and strategies that allow us to embrace the picture or the design for God's church and for networks and for the movement of the gospel. So,
Kathleen is in the heart of the city of Boston. Her and her husband are leading a church there in a what is that mile called? Give her the microphone back real quick, Zach.
it's called Methadone Mile by most
Methadone.
people, but
Yeah.
churches have, sort of transformed that into Miracle Mile.
Yep. So I have a church there intentionally to seek the welfare of that community and that city. So right here, Brian.
Yeah, so what I understood is like Paul's network strategy was very intentional, and he focused on the key cities as hub for the gospel expansion. And as well as we can see his apostolic team were very critical. Paul identified and mentored these young leaders like Titus and Timothy, we see. And also I see he could balance the expansion and the strengthening of the existing churches. He could see the cracks in the foundation of these churches and what's hindering the mission work, and he could resolve the conflicts within the church walls. So that's what I observed so far, and as well as we could see the financial and social structures supported the mission. So he utilized his tent-making ability to provide for himself, and also helping and set up an example for the young leaders. So if I talk about our time right now, what I understood is churches should function as networks and not as an isolated entities. We should isolated entities.
Islands. Like an island. It's a thing that has water
Fourth time,
all
I
around
got it. An island. Got it. Keep going.
Okay. And then mentoring young leader is very critical, is very important for the long-term sustainability, and as well as the strategic planning and financial stewardship and teamwork are essential for mission. So this is what I have been writing here. And the last thing I would say is learning from past challenges that will help us definitely to refine the future ministries and our strategies.
My goodness. Your skills in listening are superb. I mean, you did that yesterday too, where you captured the frame of everything that was said. You didn't capture everything that was said because the way Jeff drones on and on, we were going to be here till midnight, right? But you captured the framework. It wasn't a joke. It was I don't know what it was. But you captured the frame of everything.
Thank you.
That's encouraging.
Thank you.
Who else? Thinegren's thinking about it. Ray?
Hi, Kathleen. Kathleen is in Boston, but she's connected with our Little Rock network through a network in Central Arkansas. So good to see you. So I've been thinking.
Shout out.
Yeah, Mike. I've been thinking about the third question in the discussion questions. Is that off limits? Over a 5-year period, how do we design, align, or realign, if necessary, our master strategy for building strategic hubs and aggressively expanding our networks? And so, for those that know our network in Central Arkansas, we're a relational network that over our history has really sought to seek relationships with the whole church in our city, because we believe there's one church in the city. But I think what my whole journey with Bill, but particularly the last few years and with this material, is causing us to think about how do we need to realign or prioritize so that we can more aggressively work with those who want to build apostolic networks.
Second curve stuff.
Yeah, so
Second and third
so
curve stuff.
that wrestling with that you talked about, I mean, we're in that phase,
Yeah.
but we want to do that. So
Outstanding. Outstanding. Build it just like Paul, with Paul's network acumen, according to his traditioning process. Thingren, did you actually want to say something, or did me saying something make you want to say something? Which one was it?
Whatever, maybe in the mic, I got the mic. That's all. Yeah. It's a time of reflecting ourselves as a Indian leaders. Because Jeff, you worked with India for a longer time, and your statement really breaking our heart. That's a reality.
What? I didn't get that.
The statement that you made earlier is breaking his heart about the reality
But the
of
reality,
India. It is a
the
reality.
reality bites.
Am I right?
Yeah, that's right.
That's what he said, reality.
Your
bites.
assessment is reality bites. And I have to acknowledge it, and we are part and parcel of it. And yes, we are very much concerned about the materials first. We really wanted to train the leaders here and there and wanted to use the materials. Rather, we didn't go to the next level of building the apostolic level, the network. There may be problems in different places. The mainline churches, they don't go for the apostolic level leaders. And any classical Pentecost, they are all mainline. Then if you go to the organizations, then again the bureaucrats. Then only one place is left out, the classic, the global Pentecost, the independent churches, but they don't gather together. So our struggle is so much, and for long period, this has been built upon us, and we have to deconstruct the Western concept, the ruins, and reconstruct. Yes. Yeah, I do not know where to go, but one thing is very clear. This is the way of Christ and apostles. There is no other way. We have to come to this one. It's really a breaking heart. And one more thing before you're starting. Actually, this is what I've been personally, or in a group we are talking with you. I just came inside in the 2005 just like a trainer, one of the training leaders. Then once I started the network, you were very strong on me to build the network. And that's shaping a little bit. But it's very hard to communicate. We are the apostolic level leaders, which is the strange language for the people, for the organizations, denominations, and also the independent, the churches. But slowly we are constructing. Then Mike and Steve, they are very hard on working with me at the third level of the funding. So one after another is coming up. Yes, this is the way of Christ and apostles. I have to commit, dedicate, and before, as I am getting older and older, it will be passed on to the next generation, next level. I'm very seriously working on the next level leaders.
Richard came up to me yesterday afterwards and he said, you know, you pounded on me for a long time, networks, and now Michael's pounding on you to build benefactor, the third curve, you know, in it. But I'm glad you brought that up, see, because for me, we haven't really talked about it much in relation to this conference, Michael, but I've been pretty direct. Well, you were pretty direct last couple days on 2 or 3 of India networks, and I was kind of making a somewhat of a strong statement by saying, but the reason is that I mean, part of it is we didn't have a complete system, and you couldn't scale the leadership series. And plus, you got 14 languages, all this kind of stuff. But the point is, now, we talked a lot about Michael and I coming one time for a couple days and bringing the networks together and really challenging on this 10-year strategy and doing the whole thing. And I think probably some of my exhortation relates to tilling the ground, you know, before we come, because it's a little shocking to say, you know, a lot of you are doing part of the paradigm and not really building strong apostolic teams. But that's tilling the ground, because the remarkable thing after COVID is we had 18 major networks, you know, in India. Tons on, like Babu Rao has 129 small networks under his, and that's just one. But 18 major networks, and within 1 week when we sent out that challenge and information, all the networks came. And so everybody that would be in that primary category, I would regard as serious about the paradigm. You know, or they wouldn't come back on the other side of COVID. They wouldn't go through the way Michael structured finishing the degree. Shouldn't eat before I get up here. And they wouldn't be doing that phase 2, you know, in training. But so we know there's a commitment to it, but the reality is you got to build teams like this we're talking about, and very seriously build the whole paradigm. And so that's gonna change the game, you know, if you decide to do that. If, as India Networks, you decide to do that across the board. And so I'm not thinking you failed at all. I'm thinking we're tilling the ground and saying that we gotta step that up in a significant way.
Yeah, you know, the image I have in my mind, Thinagrin and Brian and Babu and others, is I have the S-curves in my head as a picture, and what we're doing here, I made a chart out of these leadership decisions from this session. And so if you think back to the S-curves and think of Paul's leadership decisions that we just talked about, I feel like we're on these S-curves and we're calling out to you. The time of North India is going to close if we don't take the opportunity that's in front of us now. And you've got to build it. You make all sorts. You've got to build it according to Paul's schema. That's the only way it's going to last past us. So, that's the heart of this. That's our heart in this. But you're the teams. You're the engines. All we can do is give you the framework. We can give you the tires and the steering wheel and the seats and the whole framework of the car. But it's worthless unless you build it. Unless you are the engine that's running the whole thing. So I really view us. We're not being hard on it or hard on you for because we're being hard on you because we need to provoke you up these curves, and we're calling out to come up these curves. So this is what we just talked about, and it goes around and around and around. Kathleen, to some of your point, that it's conflicts without, you're solving, and fears on the inside and conflicts on the outside, and you're spinning up the curve all the time. You're moving up. But just because you're moving up you're still doing these pieces down here in Paul's leadership decisions too. You're doing all these things, you're holding these in your mind all the time. Great reflections, really good reflections and learnings.
And the other thing I think that's happening in India, we weren't successful at selling the whole system to, let's say, Vishwani or to ECI or to these big networks, but the top leaders, all of them, understood the value of it. But there's, like, you were in Vijay Mahood's. He was in when we did the
Vision
cohort
India.
up there,
Yeah.
Brian, and you've got a shot to build it really right. Richard has just done some phenomenal things amongst networks. So but it's not all of Vishwani. So I think the second generation, I mean, one is a new phase, but another is, a lot of it is some of the second generation that have come out of those big movements. But now's the time to do this, in a very correct way. And that kind of commitment that we had on that page is the commitment that's needed for us to really prioritize. We won't ignore you, we won't go away, but worldwide we have to do that. It's just gotten so expansive with India and China that we have to get sharp focus. Bill mentioned in the introduction, I forgot about it because he was reading the introduction, that I comment on this being an art. Maybe a way of looking at it is the guides right out of the books, the benchmarks and everything, that's more a science in a way, because it's like you keep saying, Michael, you can actually get your hands around the whole thing, and here's the benchmarks and so on. But this is, in one sense, when you say the mental acumen, it is, there is a real art side to this, of being able to keep all those things in your mind and to be able to develop the ability to take those things that and just draw on them and apply, sometimes almost on the fly, solutions. So that's my acumen, a good word.
What else? Great reflections, Denegren. Thank you, Kathleen and Brian, George. Indians are carrying the load. Praveen, are you next? From the Birds Network, is that right?
Two things that impressed me are I'm trying to evaluate myself. That is, one is the one-mindedness among the co-workers who are working with me. And it's very difficult to bring the one-mindedness, but which is very important for the ministry. Second thing is, though there are wide doors open, but when there are cracks in your network, Paul never ventured further. He just stayed back and he developed his own team first. And then he went about for the further ministry. So those two things I learned, and they impressed me a lot. Thank you.
Outstanding. Who else? One or two things you learned. We got quite a bit more than that so far, but you know this guy, Zach? Okay. Zach has met this guy a couple times. You look really similar.
Jeff, what you were saying, the idea that there's an intuitive art to it, and yet the things that we're talking about and going back and forth between these ideas and the intuitive side, I think sharpens the intuition or the acumen. So I think what's coming clearer to me is how we shape our situation and where the potential is for a Philippian partner type church, and how to get that situation there. Where are the cracks in the existing situations that need to be addressed right away? What leaders need to be challenged? All those things have been coming clearer to me as we're thinking back and forth between these. We've been kind of working intuitively from some of the previous understanding, but the working back and forth, I think, does bring a lot of clarity around those things. It has for me in the last couple of days.
Good.
Reflections. I made a chart that some of you have already seen for Peter. And where is that? There it is. So here's Peter. Here's the whole book of Peter, based off the Petrine circle right here. But in this this fourth literary section, I've showed this, but how do you build solidarity and unity in the whole church, in the whole community, in the whole network? And Peter's answering that by, you have to build a complex state of mind. And so, Kathleen, back to these leadership decisions and conflicts without and fears within and all those things. I'm picturing these iterative process, these leadership decisions in your mind, in your complex mind. That's what you're building in yourself, and you're building in your teams. Because that's what Peter is talking about here. That's how you actually have solidarity. It's not because you're nice to each other all the time. It's because you have a true unity around what you're thinking. And it's true unity around what the core topos, if you use that language, is that you're up to. That's what unity is. That's what solidarity is. But that doesn't just happen. You develop that intentionally in your people, in your leaders, in your apostolic team. It's just amazing, Jeff, to me how all the apostles' letters fit. They're making similar arguments all the time. Just amazing. We shouldn't be amazed.
Paul was a coherent thinker. Yeah.
We shouldn't be surprised. We should be amazed, but we shouldn't be surprised by that. But one or two others, and then we'll have lunch. Solomon?
One thing that touched my heart and hit my mind is about Paul spending a lengthy 20 years of his time around Timothy, nurturing him and giving him enough exposure as well as the platform for him to take over, as well as Paul to produce himself in Timothy was such a advantage for Timothy to progress soon after Paul left. So this area, this context is really impressive to me as well as to our network, that Timothy was never born in 1 year or 2 years' time. It took 20 years, which I heard from you, is very thought-provoking to me and to our network. And I'll be able to go and reinforce these teachings so that developing leaders or producing myself in my second-level leaders takes time, patience, and determination. Thank you for these thoughts.
Yeah, and that gives clarity to what my challenge, too, of saying that in a majority of networks, I'd say this worldwide, but in a majority, they're not building the next generation at the level that it needs to be built. You know, in other words, the next generation, Paul spent 20 years, preparing. So it's got to be in your DNA to building not only a multi-level team, a third, but the third generation, the second generation, the third generation. That can't happen. In so many situations, I see that it's not there, or if it's happening, it's last minute, and it's got to be deeply embedded into what you're building. Whatever time those of us that are older have, if we haven't been doing that, it needs to be number one priority. It's just got to be number one priority.
One more? Yeah, go ahead.
In the Bible, the kings was a dynasty like father, son. And when it comes to priest, it's again a Levi, one particular tribe producing leaders after leaders. Is there any wrong that my son to take over the ministry or leadership of a particular network? In case my son is capable and to preserve the values of the elements.
So what's the point?
Father-son. He's asking a question about father-son. He gave an example of in the Old Testament, in the dynasties. Did you call them a dynasty?
Yes.
Dynasties?
Kings.
Of the kings, the
As well
son
as-
would take over from the father. And then your second example was
The priest.
priest that
The
had to be in the
Levites.
Levitical line
Yes.
in order to be a priest.
Again, there the father, son.
Father, son. So then he's using those as his reference and then saying culturally now or today, this is his scripture, topos statements.
Yeah.
And
Is
then
it
over here
wrong?
he's saying, can he appoint his son as a leader of his ministry?
Because I'm confident that I entrust my son because he is coming forward in the ministry voluntarily, understanding the vision and knowing the prevailing condition. And I'm confident that he will be able to preserve the values, the commitment, and the calling better than the others. That's my preference because God is raising him. So is any...
Well, if you say that, God is raising him, then it must be right.
Yes, that's it.
Well, I am shooting that statement down just a little bit to say, you have to be a little careful with that because that doesn't, you have to hold principles up in your mind here in some of the schema. The first thing is, in the age that we're in, Christ's church is the family. And so in your churches, is your son more your son, or are the other sons more your sons? They're all your sons.
But I prefer.
So, and then the
Is there
other,
any wrong?
so part of that argument you got to be careful with because I'm not Jeff's biological son.
So if you can't get that out of Paul's letters, what the heck? Let's go get it in the Old Testament then.
So
Sorry, go ahead.
well, I was just going to talk about Timothy and what we've talked about with Timothy. Some of those principles around Timothy, as he was well spoken of. Paul used them, and he obviously continued to develop to a point of becoming a master craftsman. He showed that he worked hard. He showed that he could develop that acumen. He had a heritage. Now, you don't always have to have that, but he had a grandmother and a mother. We don't know much about his father at all. Not really. It's not even mentioned. And so I think you have to be careful just saying, you have to be really careful saying, well, he's my son and he's coming along really good. And I think God says he needs to. Because those aren't, those statements aren't holding yourself to the topos, to the core arguments of the author. Those could be all true statements. Who are we to say whether the Spirit said that or not to you? But again, you have to hold up in your mind what are the principles in the topos in the text of the authors, and then do theology in your culture and decision making in your situation, in your unique situation.
Yeah, I would, let me add another comment to that because of the things that I said. I'm joking here, but it's a 50-50 shot because if you follow the kings, there's a good king and his son was bad. Then his son was good, his son was bad. So I'd hand it to your grandchildren. I told you it was a joke before I said it. But no, it's possible that God would raise them up. But India has a cultural practice, and every time I've seen it, it's not biblical. Because you're running an organization that you're passing on. You know, you pass on through the Timothys and the Tituses on your team that work, and God raises up in that situation. But this is an Indian cultural practice that is done almost all the time because you take one organization and pass it on to the others. It's thoroughly unbiblical. In every place that I've seen it.
Yeah, notice the difference there too. an organization versus an apostolic teams. You're not passing on an organization.
Yeah, most of the networks in India are organizationally structured. Most of them, whether it's from a discipleship organization, it's a outreach organization, it's a denomination organization, and it's very difficult to convert them into true apostolic networks. And I've seen it again and again and again that it's an organization and it's passed on to son. We have words for that, nepotism. And in most cases, it's not the way to do it. And you're really saying, I know because I can do help, but you're really saying in India, I can control him. That's what they're saying in most cases. I've been fighting this practice for 30 years in India.
All right, let's go. Brandon, don't put the camera back there. Keep the camera over here. But right over here, Zach. Oh, you're going to do it for him? Okay. We need to be careful with the north, with MENA and the Muslim territories. So
Right. So what I've been asked to share in listening to the conversation right now, their interpretation is you cannot be teaching leaders without knowing them as a father knows his son. So we need to live as family within the church to form or teach leaders.
read it again.
Do
it one more time.
You cannot be teaching leaders without knowing them as a father knows his son. So we need to live as a family to form or teach leaders. So living as a family within the church context, family of families, you must live that way, embracing your whole family as sons in order to teach them and to know them.
You have a melodramatic voice. I feel like we all need to listen to an Enya song now or something. But it's a way of life. The church is a way of life. And the whole father-son thing, that's what you're saying. It's a way, you have to live together. You have to live in community together.
So for myself, as I was pondering this, I was drawn to Philemon and listening to how Paul addresses Onesimus as his son. He feels that Onesimus is actually his son because he has embraced him that closely. That is the closeness, how we need to understand the people around us.
It's beautiful. Thank you. We're all in an aspen grove together. Can you see it? All our roots are connected. Okay, time's it. We do have time for one more. Brian, you actually had something earlier, but I guess you're not going to get a chance, Brian.
As Jeff has been referring to Indian situation regarding organizations and church, really it's a tragic situation in most of the organizations where the organizations run the churches or apostolic team. Once you de-link the organization and the church, this issue will not arise. Regarding organizational hereditary, it's okay. If the organization, the father passes on to his son, it's okay. But when it comes to church, you should strictly follow the framework.
I didn't catch that sentence.
Yeah.
Stick with what?
The framework of what the
With the
apostolic
framework. Stick with the framework.
Yeah. broader framework.
When you say an organization, it's okay, are you saying a Christian parachurch organization, or are you talking about a business that a father has?
Yeah.
Which?
No, church and organization are two separate entities.
Okay, but what kind of organization are you talking about?
A social organization,
A what?
a social, charitable organization,
I can't quite
a
understand.
charitable organization like that running. If the church is merged in this, they should be delinked.
I confess, I can't understand what you're saying yet.
Well, that's why I asked for the business clarification, because how did you conclude that the church is one thing, and so are you talking about a parachurch religious organization?
Yes, like that.
Okay, so, yeah.
So what,
We've both been a little bit, but especially me, impatient with several of you as Indian leaders. But it's really, really tough to go over all the paradigm, and you still want to hold on to a parachurch organization. You still want to hold on to passing it to your son. You still want to hold on to the big church meeting after all these discussions. You know, it's like, are you going to take this stuff serious? What is your biblical basis for saying it's okay to pass on a religious parachurch organization to your son? Why is that okay?
Okay means there's a practice there in India like that.
That's the practice
There in India.
Yeah,
But
that's
when
a-
it comes to charitable organization, a person running a charitable organization, at the same time running a church, he should not go together, running together, when he should not give the authority to his son to run both the entities.
yeah, I think I hear what you're saying now, but the
Yeah.
church is the social structure of God's plan. The church is the charitable. The church is to seek the welfare of the city. It's not a separate thing. It's not a separate thing. Because in Titus 3, what's a mature church supposed to do? To meet pressing needs and engage in good occupations in your city. And churches aren't mature enough to do that, and so they just keep doing Sunday morning events. And meanwhile, the other leaders go out and they start parachurch organizations to do charities because the church isn't doing its job. So Christ's plan is his church that is expanding and establishing itself and reaching its city and multiplying. I mean, and that's what following that schema, the watching world and rulers and heavenly authorities are going to be wowed by Christ's plan. But we got to get in that way. It's a way of thinking that's very different than Christendom and very different than the way the world thinks. Yeah, we're pretty sharp on India. Let's just we're sharp on India. But it's been, and I haven't been around the whole time of it, but I know that for 30 some years, and we've not asked for anything in return. So you get to a point where you're either going to implement it or we got to move on. So that's a downer way to end this session.
I'm not even going to
All right.
try to answer.
Lunchtime, Julie? Brian's got a great point. Give him the microphone. Let's hear your great point, Brian. You're going to stand up for it too. All right.
Yeah, I just want to put my thoughts for this. The organizational leaders' son, they are taking the lead of the organization. What I say, we do have leaders who have been working very hard in the ground to develop many leaders, especially those who are not from their family. It's an old saying in India that king's son will be a next king. Now things have changed. Not the king's son will be the next king, but the deserving one will be the next king. So the way I see my biological child to be the next leader, to give him the exposure and create an opportunity for him so that he can be the next leader. In the same way, if these youth, because I have ministry where I have people from Bihar, from Madhya Pradesh, from Haryana, from UP, I have churches, like 70 churches in my network, and most of these people are coming from different backgrounds. So it's my job as a leader to give them the same exposure that I give to my biological child, and also to create a same opportunity for them. When they are giving their time and their young life and their blood and sweat for the organization that I'm working, and that's the vision that I'm carrying, it's my job to create the same opportunity for them and let them grow and thrive and see what they are doing. It's a joy for a leader to see their spiritual children doing better than them and preaching better than them. So what I see, it is happening in India. It's not like every leader is doing. And one thing that I shared with you when I met you in Mumbai, that it's a job for every leader, for us who we are in North India, to bring them to the apostolic leadership. They are not there just to be grassroots leaders, or not just to do the menial works, but it's time for them to come in the apostolic leader. And who will give them the exposure? It's us.
That's
and
right.
they may fail.
That's right.
I am here today attending this Build seminar because somebody trusted me even when I was failed miserably. So I have to put the same trust on my young leaders, even if they're failing, even if they're not understanding. The biggest challenge we have in North India is education. But even now, they're rising up, they are getting their education. It's just that somebody has to take the lead and understand in a way that they can give them a kind of opportunity so that they can develop as an apostolic team. So that's what we are doing, and I see there are leaders who are actually behind them, like a pillar, like a mentor, who have been mentoring them and helping these people to come in the apostolic leadership. Yeah.
Good.
Yeah.
All right. That marks the end of this time. We'll have lunch. We'll gather back here at 1:45. 1:45 we'll come back here. It's 12:30 now. See you in an hour and 15.